Thanks for joining us. In the beginning, the origin of life. This is our 9th annual Society of Creation Conference. And it's my joy and privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, and that's Dr. Kevin Anderson. Dr. Anderson is the laboratory director of the Van Andel Creation Research Center of the Creation Research Society, housed on the campus of Arizona Christian University in Glendale, Arizona. He also serves as the Chief Operating Officer of the Creation Research Society. A number of you know him, at least professionally, and have listened to him before, so I know you're in for a treat for today. The only thing I want to say in introduction to Dr. Anderson is both he and I are happy that his focus is on molecular biology and not technology. When we did our run through on Thursday, he was having all kinds of problems with his computer. And he said, you know, I won't let me in. I couldn't remember my password. He said, I changed my password to Chuck Norris and the computer said, error, password too strong. And then he said, well, okay, I changed my password to 14 days. And then the computer responded, error, password 2 weeks. So we're thankful that part is over with. Kevin, I am now going to stop my share. You will be able to start your share and give us some actual information. You would not believe how well it worked when we practiced it on Thursday.
All right. Boy. There we go. Got it now? Are we good?
Not yet.
Not yet.
No. Aha, it's coming.
There we go.
There we go. Got it.
All right. Had to click one more button. I needed some Chuck Norris help. Okay, so everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
We're coming through? Okay, so here we go. All right. So of course I missed part of your talk, so I'm not totally certain what you did or didn't talk about, but I'm going to talk about what I have prepared. So there may be some overlap, but that's okay, because as I tell my students, repetition is part of learning. And if I tell it to you 4 times, then maybe I won't need to tell it to you a 5th time. So we'll just move forward from there. In essence, I gave the title of this talk, Chemicals Are Not Life, because of the approach that the secular world often takes to the whole origin of life question. And I wanted right from the beginning to ease any of Gary's fears so that, if I can get this to work, why is it frozen up on me? There we go. So they recognize that this message is Chuck Norris approved, so we're doing okay. So we're ready to go. All right.
Good job.
Now, when we're addressing the question of origin of life, we really have to start with the primary question, and that is, what is life? And the irony is that it's really not easy to define. In fact, there is no single universally accepted definition of life. And the reason for that is because life is so complex and it involves so many aspects that no single definition really encompasses all of that. And because of the difficulty defining life, that often then makes it difficult when you're talking about, well, what is the origin of life? That people say, well, it depends on how you define life. Now, we would recognize that there is a non-living world and there's a living world. And there's a clear difference between the living and non-living world. Even if we cannot easily identify what life is, we know what life is intuitively. And as such, then we recognize, well, that is living, that is not living. And so it's been well regarded, obviously, that there's a huge gulf between the living and the non-living. Now, claims of self-assembly of life, that it somehow assembled itself from the non-living world, try to bridge the huge gulf between the two worlds. Clearly, they always fall short, and therein is the dilemma that is faced by people promoting the claims of self-assembly, is they always fall short. In fact, they fall woefully short. So in many ways then, instead of winning by or succeeding by accomplishment, the secular world tries to win by definition. So they want to change the definition of life. And as we see here in 1965 at a symposium, the comment was made that it's meaningless to use the term life. Now recognize the context, and that was during a question and answer at a conference on the origins of pre-biological systems. In other words, they were attempting, even back in 1965, to explain how did non-living systems bridge that gulf and become living? How did they self-assemble? And because you can't really do it, the idea was, well, we have to recognize that we need to redefine the term life. So in other words, if we redefine the term life, then we move the gulf, we shorten the gulf, and therefore it becomes easier. So it's a winning by definition. It's not really a winning by actually achieving success in creating or self-assembly of life. So this leaves us really even still today with, this is the popular view that somehow in some formation, a bubbling ooze of mud, a volcanic vent, something, that molecules began to assemble themselves and ultimately assembled themselves into what would be clearly identified today as life. Now, creationists come along and challenge that, and we get what is I often describe as the face. You know, if you're a creationist that's a scientist that's in the secular, been in the secular scientific community, at some point you will get the face. They'll look at you like you're claiming what? How in the world could you possibly believe such a ridiculous thing? So of course, creationists claim no life was created, it didn't self-assemble, and that gets you the face. How on earth could you believe such a ridiculous thing? Because here's what we believe, and this is stated by George Wald in 1955, but it still holds today. Given enough time, the formation of life will almost certainly happen at least once. Time is, in fact, the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. And so there we have it. Time does the job. Isn't that amazing? And so bear in mind that Wald is also a Nobel laureate, so he supposedly represents the best thinking the scientific community has to offer. So time is the miracle. Now, of course, I've never seen time work like that, neither of you, but it's okay, because if it doesn't involve creation, then anything is acceptable. And so time makes things that are impossible actually possible. So time replaces God. But we have to recognize, what else would we expect a fallen world to say? Remember, Jesus said that wide is the road and many on it that lead to destruction. The simple fact that our views are not popular in no way should be a discouragement, because Jesus was not popular, God is not popular. So certainly God's views and ideas that God presented are not going to be popular. Instead, time becomes God. And let's back up for just a moment. Aristotle is attributed with suggesting that there's some type of vital force, vitalism, if you will, that is able to create or able to take non-living matter and organize it to make living matter. And this vital force really just exists as part of our overall world. It's just there in the air, if you will. And this was more or less the dominant thinking for many centuries. In fact, even into the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, you still had some concept of that inanimate material like a dirty shirt and maybe some wheat or some type of grain, along with the vital force interacting, would take and self-organize, and you'd have mice. Or you'd have maggots on a piece of meat, or you'd have frogs coming out of a puddle of mud, or you'd have algae growing in a jar of water. So in some ways, this is what was observed in their opinion at that time, is that some force interacted with inanimate material like a piece of meat or a jar of water, and life would occur. And this became known as spontaneous generation. Now, there was a number of experiments that challenged spontaneous generation through the 17th and 18th and even to the 19th century. But the one that is often pointed to as the real kill, if you will, the real slap against spontaneous generation, was the work done by Louis Pasteur involving swan neck flasks. And in it, he was able to demonstrate that nothing would grow in the swan neck flask that was sterilized but left open to the air. But if you then broke open the top so that it had direct exposure instead of the swan neck, then you would get growth. And this then was viewed as dispelling the idea that there was a vital force that reorganized material and made non-living matter into matter. In other words, was able to span the gulf between the non-living world and living world. And this led then to what is even today recognized as the law of biogenesis. Law of biogenesis states that you only get life from life. It does not reorganize from non-life. It's the law. Now, this brings us to what is then viewed in the secular world, and we'll go back again to George Wald. He said, most biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, no, it's a choice, it's an unwillingness, okay, are left with nothing. In other words, they have no explanation of how life came about. And this brings us then to the situation where the teacher will spend a lecture disproving spontaneous generation, but then because they have no alternative, they'll then turn around and say, in effect, that life spontaneously arose. Now, they'll use different names. They won't use the term spontaneous generation, but they'll in effect say the same thing, that life somehow spontaneously arose in some primitive atmosphere at some point way back in the past. So the current thinking in the scientific community, I think, is expressed by Franklin Harold in his book, The Way of the Cell, which is an excellent read, by the way, if you're wanting to understand just some dynamics of the cell, even though it's obviously written by someone who accepts the secular interpretations of origin of life. And in this, on page 236, he states that life arose here on Earth from inanimate matter. In other words, referencing back to spontaneous generation, even though he does not use that term, by some kind of evolutionary process about 4 billion years ago. Now, he does recognize this is not a statement of demonstrable fact, but an assumption almost universally shared by specialists as well as by scientists in general. It is not supported by any direct evidence, and that's certainly true, nor is it likely to be. But it is consistent with what evidence we do have. Now, I have no idea what evidence that Dr. Harold thinks that we have. The idea of life coming from inanimate material is purely a hand wave to avoid the obvious, and that is that life was created. So I think he just kind of invents evidence that he says it's consistent with, because it's actually inconsistent with any evidence that we have. Now, in an attempt to get some type of demonstrable evidence that life can self-assemble, we'll go back to, for example, 1952 with the famous Miller-Urey experiment, where they had an atmosphere of methane and ammonia and hydrogen and water, and they ran an electrical charge through it, and they were able to collect then a few amino acids. In fact, they collected glycine and alanine and aspartic acid and said, voila, some amino acids self-assemble, and therefore if they self-assemble, then life will self-assemble. And they made that huge leap of conclusion. Other people have picked up from their experiment, and they have then I actually found additional amino acids in the mix. But of course, there's many non-biological amino acids in the mix as well. And one thing that's not mentioned very much is in the mix as well as formic acid, which I would call a chemical poison. Formic acid will react with these amino acids and it'll destroy their ability of being able to form any kind of peptide chain. In fact, formic acid will react with a lot of the biological materials they would claim would be forming in this mix. And it'll kill the reactions because it will destroy the process of building any kind of complex molecular, biomolecular structure. Also, Freeman Dyson, in his book Origins of Life, he admits that the gas containing the neon, molecular hydrogen, methane, and ammonia, all the reducing molecules that Miller needed for his experiment to work, did not condense in the neighborhood of Earth, but moved out away from the sun to form Jupiter and the planets beyond. In other words, by his understanding of early history of the solar system, he's saying those gases weren't even around, and therefore the conditions that Miller used were not the appropriate conditions. Life would have had to form under a different set of conditions, which then he continues then to say, since Miller's beguiling picture of a pond full of dissolved amino acids under a reducing atmosphere has been discredited, a new beguiling picture has come to take its place. The new picture has life originating in a hot, deep, dark little hole on the ocean floor. Now, actually, these are only beguiling when you're trying to deny God's handiwork. There's nothing beguiling about them to the chemistry aspect, because even the deep, dark little hole in the ocean floor doesn't get you any further than Miller's experiment does, and doesn't get you any further than anything else. And around they go. And so this really brings us to all kinds of claims out there of where the life came from, the conditions necessary for life. And this is what really we're seeing in the secular world. They're just chasing their tail because they have nothing. And therefore, that's why there's so many ideas out there, because there's no idea out there. So when you have no idea, then you can postulate all kinds of ideas. All right. In fact, we recognize that even the geochemical literature is now telling us that there's evidence that there was oxygen present in the early atmosphere of the so-called ancient Earth. Now, oxygen is highly destructive, it's highly reactive, and therefore it really would have interacted and destroyed any biological molecule that'd be working to form or self-assemble. And that's why they always wanted to leave oxygen out when they were trying to postulate atmospheres that would bring about the origin of life. But if you have oxygen present, then that's a killer. You have to recognize that if you're in a CO2, CO, nitrogen atmosphere, this is going to form nitrites. And nitrites, just like oxygen, are going to be highly reactive. They're going to be very destructive to any molecules that are trying to self-assemble. Also needs to be recognized that chemical reactions that build necessary molecules also break them down. If it's capable of reacting to build, it's capable of reacting to break down. And lots of contaminating molecules then are going to be also within the mix. And as I mentioned with formic acid and the nitrites, for example, they will counteract your building of these complex macromolecules necessary for life to form. There's another problem faced, and this problem, of course, creationists have addressed several times, so I'll just mention it, and that is the chirality problem. When you spontaneously form an amino acid, it will form either a L or a D version, which is essentially the left and right hand version. But in life, only the L amino acids are what are used. A few bacteria use D amino acids in a very specialized manner, but other than that, they're all L amino acids. But also we got to recognize the same thing with carbohydrates. Many of the monomers of carbohydrates, you'll get an L and a D, but unlike amino acids, it's the D form of the carbohydrate that is what is used in making the biological molecules. The problem that this presents is there's no natural way known that will separate the L's and the D's. So if you have a natural formation of an amino acid, you're going to have a mixture of both an L and a D. A natural formation of a monosaccharide, you're going to have a mixture of an L and a D. And there's no way that you can get optical purity. even if you had some mechanism that would give you a slight preference to an L or to a D, that doesn't give you optical purity. 55% of L is not going to work. 75% of D is not going to work. You still need 100%. And you cannot get that by any known natural process. Doug Axe mentions that, and he's with the Discovery Institute in Seattle. He mentions that he had a test question one time which asked which of the biological macromolecules is apt to have been the first living molecule. And of course, he balked at the idea that any molecule could be living, correctly balking at the idea any molecule could be living. And he describes it then that he wrote down the correct answer by what the teacher wanted, but then he explained why he thought this was a incorrect, I would say bogus question, and he wound up getting deducted points for stating that he didn't think that it's possible that you could identify a molecule as living. But he was totally correct. The teacher was totally wrong. Molecules are not living. Life is not just a molecule, hence back to the title of my talk. You may have a protein, but that's not life. You may have a strand of DNA, but that's not life. You may have a strand of cellulose, but that's not life. Life may make those molecules. Those molecules may be associated with life, but they are not life. They're not living molecules. In fact, I would challenge that when the secular world gets all excited about having somehow demonstrated the self-assembly of a peptide or the self-assembly of a short strand of a carbohydrate, and we see many articles touting these things, but really to me, it's like bragging about going 2 steps up a ladder in an attempt to reach Mars. It's trivial. You are achieving nothing for the most part in demonstrating how life could have self-assembled or spontaneously formed. You've gone 2 steps up an enormous ladder. And it's interesting that the 2 steps is really all they can get. Oh, maybe someday they'll get 3 or 4 steps up, but that'll be it. And again, it's trivial. And that's, as Gary mentioned in his talk, why for the most part, the secular world does not really spend a lot of time publicly talking about origin of life because they have very little to talk about. Now you'll get the textbooks and they'll make all kinds of silly comments and acting like that somehow it's all been demonstrated out, which is a brainwashing, an intended brainwashing of the student, that somehow it's been all figured out how life self-assembled. But the truth of the matter is they don't have anything figured out. And in fact, don't believe me, let's go to James Tour, who is a synthetic chemist. He states that those who think that scientists understand the issues of prebiotic chemistry are wholly misinformed. Nobody understands them. Nobody has a clue how life could have self-assembled. So anything you see in a textbook, anything you see in a journal article, anything you see on television, they're just speculating. And it's really almost not even in the level of speculation. It's just simply wild guesses. So formation of a few organic molecules is not life. It's not even close to life. So let's just dispense that. In fact, we got to recognize that the first forms of life, and this would be the very rudimentary forms for it to still be categorized as life. The first forms of life had to reproduce. That's a basic characteristic of any living system, is it can reproduce. If it can't reproduce, then it's not going to be categorized as life. It has to also be able to convert energy, some source of energy, some external source of energy. We call this catabolism. It's got to be able to convert it. It's got to be able to convert it to energy that it can use then for biosynthesis. We'd call that anabolism. So it's got to be able to take some external source of energy, convert it to a usable form of energy, and biosynthesize. It's got to then be able to make itself, which is how it reproduces. It's got to also be able to respond to environmental changes. That's one of the basic essences of living systems, is they respond to the environmental changes. And it has to establish what I call a non-equilibrium with its environment. Now, very simply put, what that means is the non-equilibrium is that the concentration content inside the living system, and we'll just describe it as cell because the cell is the basics of the living systems. What's inside the cell cannot necessarily be the same as what's outside the cell. So if you have a higher concentration of some salt, that can't be the concentration inside the cell. The concentration of the potassium outside the cell is not necessarily going to be the concentration of potassium inside the cell. So the cell has to establish what would be considered a non-equilibrium. It can't just be whatever the environment is, that's what's in its internal situation is, because then it's not living. The temperature of a rock is whatever the temperature outside is, okay? But a lot of biological systems, including you, that's not your temperature. You're at a non-equilibrium temperature-wise. That's why dead bodies assume room temperature, because they're no longer living. Now, a bacterial cell, it is in a situation where it can't regulate its temperature. It is then dependent on what the outside temperature is. But the bacterial cell then has to respond by doing various things to respond to the temperature. It has to make certain proteins. It has to eliminate certain proteins if the temperature is not favorable. So go back to the response to the environmental changes. So hence that non-equilibrium environment is a very key characteristic of life. And even your first forms of life had to establish this non-equilibrium. Otherwise, they're just a rock. They're just a molecule laying there. They're not life. A fundamental problem that science has never been able to solve is how to produce energy flow through the system to do this work of coding in order to produce, for example, a functioning protein. Living systems do, of course, harness energy for this purpose, but only because the required purposeful, assembled metabolic machinery is already in place and functioning. In other words, a fundamental problem science has never been able to solve is how you would go about those processes I just talked about in your self-assembled organism. In other words, how an organism is going to self-assemble in order to achieve all of this, because as Bloom mentions, this is out of his How Blindness is the Watchmaker, published in 2001, as he mentioned, what we see today is in order to do these things, they already have all the machinery in place. They're not building the machinery from scratch, it's already in place. So how did this machinery self-assemble? How do you get that in order to achieve what's considered a living system? And even Richard Dawkins, in his The Greatest Show on Earth, acknowledges the difference between life and non-life. In other words, that huge gulf between the non-living and the living world is a matter not of substance, because you can have all the chemistry of life, but not have life. Okay, it's a matter not of substance, but of information. Living things contain prodigious quantities of information. And so as Bloom mentioned in that previous quote, living systems have the code, they have the information to tell them how to assemble all the machinery necessary to be able to achieve the conversion of energy, to be able to achieve the reproduction, to be able to achieve the biosynthesis necessary. It's information that allows them to do that. So this brings us then to the key question, really, and that is, where did the information come from? And we need to be very clear, physics and chemistry do not produce codes. Okay? You can have a lot of physics involved in a lot of the structures in living systems, a lot of chemistry involved in the structures of living systems, but that physics and that chemistry did not produce the code, the information that Dawkins referred to, that living systems must have. So we have a paper that I have shown on the screen that says, natural selection favored DNA structures that were most energetically stable. But the problem with that is, where's the information in that? You have a DNA structure, big deal. Does this DNA structure provide biological information? Because not any DNA structure does. Only certain DNA structures do. So for example, and this is skipping the RNA step, just go directly, then AGA on the DNA strand is the genetic code for the amino acid serine. TTC is genetic code for the amino acid lysine, and CTT is genetic code for the amino acid glutamate. Now, thermostability has nothing to do with the genetic language convention that allows us to convert AGA into serine. The genetic language convention is completely separate from the chemistry involved. The chemistry of AGA has nothing to do with the chemistry of the amino acid serine. And therefore, the code is not just simply a matter of chemistry. AGA no more means serine than anything else, except that the genetic language convention says AGA means serine. But it's not a matter of the chemistry of AGA. That has nothing to do with it. It's not a matter of the chemistry of CAT. See, in English, CAT is spelled cat. But in DNA language, CAT is the language that gives us the amino acid valine. So thermostability of the chemistry of CAT and CTT and AGA has nothing to do with the genetic language convention. And therefore, even though that paper was offered as a key resolution of the origin of biological information, it has nothing to do with the origin of biological information. And it, as a creationist, it frustrates me to see these kind of papers touted as some kind of answer when they answer nothing. But again, it's demonstration of how desperate the secular world is to explain the biological origin of life without a creator. In fact, one has to recognize non-random alignment does not equal information. Lawrence Krauss, among others, loves to point to crystals as examples of self-assembled information. Of course, I always want to say, well, Lawrence, what exactly is the crystal telling you? If you hold it up to the ear, what's it saying? Because you may claim that there is some, non-random alignment because the crystal will line up in a way based upon the polarity of the atoms within it. But what's the information that provides? I can set a group of rocks in a straight line, and clearly that's a non-random alignment, but that doesn't mean there necessarily has to be any kind of code to it. People talk a lot about the self-organization of the crystal structure of snowflakes, as if that contains some kind of information. But I've never heard anybody tell me what information the snowflake is telling us other than it's snowing. So it comes back again that non-random alignment is not equal to information. In fact, in the biological world, information is often information is often a non-sequential, or information is often a non-linear alignment. So if we say information provides instruction or a message or a code, then non-random alignment is not obligated to provide any of that. So the simple fact that a crystal will provide some kind of non-random alignment doesn't mean there's any useful information in the crystal. And in fact, crystal structuring has nothing to do with how information is contained within biological systems. Okay. When we look at biological information, we recognize the biological information, and this would be back to even the very most primitive life forms. Biological information must be contained within a biomolecule. Okay, while information itself is non-material, it must be contained within a material substance. In the case of DNA, the chemistry of the molecule contains the information, but the chemistry is not the information, such as the ink on a printed page contains the information. It's the carrier of the information, but the ink itself is not the information. So in the simplest of biological systems, your early primitive biological formation of life, you have to have a carrier for the biological information. It must be on some kind of biomolecule. Okay. In fact, DNA is a very passive molecule. It doesn't do anything. It is done to. It's like the ink on the page. The ink on the page doesn't do anything, it just presents the information. So the DNA must be decoded by another molecule because DNA does not decode itself. So here we have to have another molecule coming in. Oh, I'm sorry, one other thing then, DNA or the carrier of the biological information has to be replicated with precision. And I find this is often not discussed very much. Let's say, for example, you've probably all heard the analogy of, infinite number of monkeys typing away over a long enough period of time, they'll give you a, Hamlet. Okay, let's just pretend that happens. Okay, let's pretend that happened. All right, now, so you've got your one living system that has, that has Hamlet, has the information containing biological molecule. Now, you now need to copy that to make a second cell, second form of life, because life does, it replicates. If you had one, cell come together as your earliest cell, but it couldn't replicate itself, then over time, instead of time being the hero, over time it just break back down and there'd be no life again. Okay, so it has to be able to replicate itself. So it's got to be able to replicate this biological molecule that contains the information, and it's got to be able to replicate it with precision. So let's take our Hamlet that the monkeys have typed up, and now you tell the monkeys, okay, now give me a second copy. Well, they can either spend then the next, however many hundreds of billions of years typing, in which case then their original form, their original version of Hamlet all decays again and they've got nothing. Or what'll be is you say, okay, I'm going to give you a Xerox copy machine, even though you don't deserve it because you haven't done that. But I'll give you a Xerox copy machine. But the problem is this Xerox copy machine is very error prone. It doesn't do a very good job of copying. And in fact, that's what the evolutionist community tells us, is that the early replication systems in the early life did not replicate with great precision. And supposedly to them, that's a good thing, because that means then all kinds of mutations are able to be introduced. And that allowed all kinds of changes to occur. Of course, to me, it's like, well, if you're photocopying something on a very bad photocopier, it just degrades each time you photocopy. And so you have this biological molecule that's being replicated. You have your Hamlet, pristine copy of Hamlet, but now you copy it on a very error-prone photocopier, and now it has a lot of error in it. It's got a lot of blank pages, a lot of left-out sentences. And so suddenly, even though your monkeys type this beautiful copy of Hamlet, now you don't have a very good copy of Hamlet. And now they're going to replicate it again. And now it gets worse and worse. And so instead of advancing upward and the first cell now moving forward and becoming 2 cells and 4 cells and eventually becoming, becoming human, instead it now just deteriorates into nothing, because all that wonderful necessary biological information degrades away and the cell no longer knows what it's doing, and it can't maintain that non-equilibrium with its environment because it doesn't have the instructions of how to replicate, of how to build itself, of how to metabolize, and it all falls apart. So we see even the first cell had to be able to replicate with precision, and how that would have occurred, no one, that's completely beyond the realm of possibility, no matter how much time. Okay, biological information also must be decoded by another molecule. It said DNA is a passive molecule. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't read itself. There has to be another molecule that reads it. So for example, in cells today, we would have polymerases, we would have ribosomes. They are involved in reading the biological information contained in the information containing biomolecules. So you can't just simply have DNA form and call that life. The DNA isn't life. DNA is a component of life. You have to have a lot of different pieces of machinery in there. Biological information in the earliest cell also must provide information for events in the cell. In other words, as part of replication, you have to have protein synthesis. Protein synthesis has to be directed by the instructions of the biological information. So you got to decode that biological information by some process, and then that decoded information has to be able to instruct the cell, here's how you build proteins, here's how you make more DNA, here's how you make another cell, here's how you do metabolic activity. So it had to have all of these functions going on in the very first living cells. And Biological information must also be able to direct numerous cell processes, even in the simplest of cells. Has to be able to direct, here's how you transport molecules, here's how you metabolize, here's how you catabolize, here's how you convert energy, here's how you use that converted energy. Had to be able to do all of that. So it can't be just a very, very simple, SOS type biological information. It had to be enough biological information, even in the earliest of cells, to be able to do all of this. Otherwise, it's not life. And in fact, it'll just decompose into nothing again, and there'll be no life there. So when you're talking about trying to bridge that gulf between non-living and living, you see how much larger this gulf keeps becoming when we begin to recognize exactly what's involved in the living world and what it would take to get that even first so-called simplest cell, simplest life. Okay, so as we've been mentioning, life is much more than a chemical combination. It's not a matter of finding the right ingredients. If I just take a bowl and mix the right ingredients together, I got life. That's not life. A dead body has all the chemicals for life, but it's still a dead body. There's still some key components missing. So it's not just a chemical combination that gives us life. And in fact, here is my challenge to the secular world, and that is that I'll give you any atmospheric condition you want, any temperature you want, any combination of gases you want, anything you want. I'll give you any combination of macromolecules. Now, you don't deserve that, because macromolecules themselves are a challenge to make, but I'll let you go to the store and buy all the amino acids. In fact, I'll let you go to the store and buy all the proteins. I'll let you go to the store and buy all the fatty acids, all the carbohydrates individually. I'll let you buy all of that. As I say, you don't deserve that, but as an illustration of how you still can't do it, I'll let you start with all of that. And I still challenge, you will not then be able to mix it together and get a self-assembled living system. It's not going to happen. And if it can't happen under that setting, then that itself is all the proof any scientist, any true scientist should need that it cannot happen. And therefore, it's unscientific to say that life could self-assemble when this experiment fails, because this experiment demonstrates it won't happen. Therefore, from a scientific perspective, we must conclude that it can't happen. So remember George Wald, time is in fact the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. One is only to wait, time itself performs the miracles. In what world does that happen? Not in the world we live in. I don't care how much time you have, it's not going to happen. And we've seen this repeatedly over and over. And that's why my challenge is out there. I don't care how much time you put into that. You're not going to get self-assembly of life. And in fact, this brings us to what I like to describe as the infinite escape clause. This was stated by a scientist named Peter Mora at the 1965 meeting, The Origins of Pre-Biological Systems, where they were challenging that the term life is meaningless. Okay, he says, I believe we developed this practice, the practice of what? Referring to infinite time. I believe we developed this practice to avoid facing the conclusion that the probability of a self-replicating state is zero. Note, he doesn't say is very low. He doesn't say is unlikely. He says the probability is zero. These escape clauses postulate an almost infinite amount of time and an almost infinite amount of material so that even the most unlikely event could have happened. When the condition of infinite time and matter has to be invoked, the concept of probability is annulled. By such logic, we can prove anything. See, and that's what Wald is doing. He's referring to infinite amounts of time. Give me all kinds of time and anything can happen. And as Mora is pushing back correctly, I would argue, that kind of reasoning gets us nowhere, because by such logic, we can prove anything. We can prove that black is white and white is black. We can prove that up is down and down is up. It gets us nowhere. And from a scientific perspective, it needs to be rejected because it's scientifically meaningless. So an infinite escape clause is just that. It's a way of trying to escape the obvious conclusion that life does not self-assemble. Even with infinite amount of time, it doesn't self-assemble. There has to be a creator that created life. Hence the law of biogenesis, which is a scientific law. Okay, so let's see what the Apostle Paul wrote in the letter to the Colossians. He said, for by him, which of course the him is Jesus, for by him all things created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principles or powers, all things created through him and for him. And so what we see is that the only way we have to bridge the huge gulf between non-life and life is Jesus, the creator. He's the only thing that does it. Nothing else does it. Interesting little quote. This is attributed to Louis Pasteur, and other people have said something similar. A little science estranges a man from God because he thinks he knows it all of a sudden, and he doesn't know much of anything. A little science estranges man from God, but much science leads them back to him. We may look in the textbook and think, oh, they've got it all figured out. Life self-assembled. It came about by, certain atmospheric condition, a certain mixture of chemicals, and voila, life formed. But then as you understand it better, as you gain in scientific understanding of the chemistry and the physics behind it, you then recognize, no, that's not the case after all. And you then begin to come back to God. You begin to come back to recognizing that the only explanation that makes any sense of where light came from is it was created. It cannot self-assemble. It must have been created. So with that, then I will say thank you. And I guess we open it up to questions.
Yes, we can open it up to questions. Thank you very much, Kevin. This is great stuff. I love hearing this stuff. If you are a little bit like me and you're saying, whoa, there's a lot of stuff going by here, can I just ask you to remember two things? Number one, there are first-rate scientists who accept the creation model of origins. Number two, don't let anybody tell you that creation is not scientific or less scientific. And thirdly, you got to go back and become a PhD microbiologist like Dr. Anderson. So I'm going to...
Gary, you mentioned that as scientific, the only scientific explanation we have for life is that it was created.
Absolutely.
Because we can go to the laboratory and we can create all kinds of things because we created them. They didn't self-assemble. So the only scientific explanation is life was created.
Good. I'm going to check, if you have a question, I'll check the Q&A first. I'll jump into the chat here too, and let's see. Okay, yeah. Lots of comments. Good presentation, Kevin, very good. Just a comment here, when people realize the impossibilities of non-life becoming life, they start talking about multiverses. And of course, multiverse was originally designed as a selection of universes, just because of the characteristics of our universe are so finely tuned. But yeah, good comment. If you have a question, feel free to put something in Q&A, or I can check the chat also. Question for you, Kevin. Are there any current origin of life experiments being conducted?
Oh, all the time. A few years ago, Harvard put $1 million into their Origin of Life Center. So yeah, they're doing it all the time. The irony is, you haven't heard any success. They're putting a lot of money into it, a lot of effort to it. You haven't heard any success because it's not successful. A lot of Origin of Life, they'll do some experiments, but a lot of Origin of Life also involves just sitting around postulating. So, because, and granted, postulation is part of the scientific process. I don't get me wrong in that, but they'll come up with an idea, they'll try it, it won't work. So then they'll sit around for a long time trying to come up with another idea. And again, that's part of science, but what we see is during all of our entire lifetime, there's been many experiments done that have all failed. And like I say, all they've really accomplished is that they get maybe 2 steps up the ladder. We got 2 or 3 amino acids joined together, starting to form a peptide. And of course, then it breaks apart because all the energy that would be going into forming the molecule would also be breaking it apart again. So
do you want to share a name or two of an evolutionary origin of life theorist? I'm thinking of Jeffrey Bada, or another current name if folks are interested that they can.
He would be the first one that would come to mind for me. To be honest, again, you can Google it, because I don't necessarily follow any particular origin of life person, so I haven't paid that much attention to who says what, and so no, except for Bada, no names really come to mind all that quickly. But you can quickly Google and see experimentations that are being done. And I don't know if there really is any particular leading person in the field, because again, the field isn't going anywhere. So,
Kevin, can I ask a question just live here?
sure.
So there was a comment posted in, I think it was the Q&A box about time. And part of my response was that time isn't really an agent or an actor. Time doesn't do anything. Time is a characteristic of the world that we live in. So therefore, when we talk about time as being capable of producing all kinds of forms of life as well as life itself, we're really talking nonsense, because time is a condition rather than an agent or actor. Would you agree or disagree? Or?
Yes, you're completely correct. Time is not an agent that acts or does something. Time is just simply a measurement of you keep on to use time as a definition of time. Time is just simply a product of a created world. You have to have a beginning point, and then there is a process of time from that beginning point. But time is not an agent. Time doesn't interact and cause something to happen. The whole thing that Wald's trying to allude to is that there's all these chemical reactions occurring, and if you give them enough time, they're going to finally accomplish something. But it's kind of like when Hawkins was trying to argue that gravity formed the universe. Okay, gravity is an observation of the universe. Gravity is not a condition that causes the universe. It's a consequence of the universe. So I always found that as a very odd suggestion, because if you don't have the universe, you don't have gravity. If you don't have the universe, you don't have time. So you have to have agents that are doing something, acting in time, but time itself doesn't do anything. And obviously there's a lot more on this topic we could talk about, but you enter into the whole concept of thermodynamics, and over time what we see is thermodynamics actually kicks you in the butt, because the longer the situation goes on, the worse it becomes thermodynamically. And so time really isn't the hero. Time actually is working against you.
I have a couple questions here in the Q&A, Kevin. Let's see how we do. I see how you say the creation is the best scientific explanation, but many will a priori exclude the quote supernatural. In other words, God is excluded from science by definition. So how do you respond? And part of that is, how do you define science?
Yeah, and of course, excluded from science by definition, but it's, well, whose definition? It's the definition of those, it's the definition offered by those that are trying to exclude God. There's nothing inherent within science that says that God cannot be accounted for. In fact, in the very famous Lewontin quote that creationists like to point to, where he talks about the divine foot, he acknowledges that there's nothing inherent in science that says that you can't have the divine foot. We just don't want the divine foot. That's what he's really saying in the quote. So there's no reason that science has to be defined as a process where God cannot be included, or science has to be defined excluding God. That's just the definition given by those that want to exclude God. And in so doing, when they define science that way, what they're doing is they're limiting their toolbox, as Paul Nelson likes to talk about. They're limiting their toolbox of what science really can explain and what science can really address by saying that any interaction of God, and right, science can't analyze God directly because God doesn't fit in the test tube. God's not amenable to a scientific process done by humans, but God can interact with his creation, and any interaction with his creation will leave a footprint that science can detect. And that's one of the things in my next talk I'm going to talk about is the footprints, or the fingerprints, if you will, of God all over biology. And we can observe those. But if we are going to discount God, then what happens is we can't come up with the right explanation. If God did create, then when you exclude God, what you're doing is you're rendering science incapable of drawing the right conclusion. So it certainly behooves any reasonable scientist to say, we're going to leave open any possibility that can then fit or be observed by our scientific process. And that would also include creation, because as I mentioned, the only thing we've ever observed as far as origin of life is creation. So creation becomes a scientific explanation. When you have scientists that say, no, it can't be creation because that creator can't be accounted for in science, now what you've done is you've limited science and it's no longer capable of addressing or coming up with the right answer. And therefore, even by our own explanation of how science functions, and we see that creation is the only explanation, you're basically making science incapable of coming up with that explanation. And therefore, you've rendered science essentially impotent.
Great. Another question. What would you say to those who claim God used evolution to develop various life forms?
Well, there's a lot of facets to that question. The first is that the evolutionary process certainly is explained in the textbooks and is as offered by the scientific community, the secular scientific community, is a very inaccurate, rather inept, stumbling, bumbling type of process. And the Bible tells us the first thing that God created was wisdom. There's no wisdom in the evolutionary process. And therefore that becomes contradictory to the very nature that God is describing of how he created. The first thing he created was wisdom. So obviously wisdom was there as part of the creation. And yet I'm going to use a very unwise, stumbling, bubbling process. So that becomes contradictory to the very nature that God is describing. Also, we have to recognize creation is engineering. It's not science. And let me explain that. Science is the tool that we humans use to try to understand, to try to figure out what's happening here. How's this happen? Why did this happen? What's going on? What's the events going on? Engineering then is taking the knowledge learned from those scientific explorations and using it to build something. You hope that the person building that bridge you're about ready to drive over did not engage in a lot of scientific experimentation as part of putting that bridge together. You hope that was already all done. Okay, so God did not have to do scientific experimentation to understand how to build the universe or how to make life. Excuse me. He didn't have to do that. He went straight to the engineering part. So what we see then is that evolution is not good engineering. If God used evolution, he's not a very good engineer. And that comes back again, then who do you say God is? Is God the ultimate creator, infinite in his wisdom, infinite in his intelligence, infinite in his knowledge? Or is he stumbling, bumbling, trying to figure stuff out? God would be the ultimate engineer because he doesn't have to experiment. Well, will this work? Will that work? How does this work? What's going on here? He already knows. So it's just a matter of he makes it. He engineers it. And so therefore it's, to me, totally contradictory to say that the ultimate engineer used a stumbling, bumbling process to create or to engineer his universe, this world, and life.
You're doing so well. We're going to hit you one last time. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. It seems scientists are now realizing the greatest barrier to space exploration by people is cosmic radiation. How then could life begin in such a natural environment that's poisonous to life?
And that's obviously quite correct. Quite correct. They want to use the energy from the cosmic rays as the energy to begin to build these molecules, but then they want to quickly get rid of that energy because it's going to destroy those molecules. So it's like they want, we're going to start and use the cosmic energy, and we get this molecule. Okay, now cosmic energy, go away. We don't want you anymore. You're not needed anymore because you're going to destroy what we just made. And so literally it is having your cake and eating it too. And so yes, the very energy that they would point to as necessary and able to create the first basic molecular structures to build life would also be the energy that would destroy those structures as well. Yeah, nothing would form, no life form would develop on an Earth bombarded with all the cosmic radiation that Earth would be bombarded by if we weren't protected by, 2 miles worth of oxygen.
Excellent. Thank you. We really appreciate the presentation. So what we're going to do, just a second, I'll see if Dr. Heck has any words for us, but we're going to stop now to allow folks a time to get up, wander around, grab a bite or whatever. We start again at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Central Daylight Time. Joel, do you have any words you want to say?
No, I don't think there are any announcements that I can think of that are on the drawing board. So let's just take a little bit extra time for the lunch hour and we'll get back together.
Okay, sounds good.
Later.
Somebody asked that I have all my 6 evidences listed. These are the words. I tried to type some notes. I was hoping to be able to put some things together in a better way. They'll ultimately be on our website, but here that is. So thank you all very much. We're going to take a break. In an hour and 15 minutes, we'll start up again with Dr. Kevin Anderson.
I think